November 23, 1943. 18,000 feet above the Gilbert Islands. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butcher Hare's hands gripped the throttle of his F6F Hellcat as the Pacific sun blazed off his canopy. Below, the tiny coral atoll of Tarawa was barely visible through scattered clouds, a speck of white sand that had become a killing ground for Marines. But Hare's attention was locked on the horizon, where formation of dark specks grew larger with each passing second. Bogies, 12 o'clock high. Count 9, no, 12 zeros inbound. The voice crackled through his headset. Hare pushed the stick forward, feeling the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine respond with a surge of raw power. Around him, 7 other Hellcats from VF2 followed suit, their blue-gray paint schemes making them look like sharks descending from above. The Japanese pilots were confident. They had every reason to be. For 2 years, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had ruled these skies with impunity. Lightweight, nimble, with a turn radius that could make any American pilot sweat, the Zero had humiliated every fighter the U.S. Navy had thrown at it. The Wildcat, the Buffalo, even the vaunted P-38 Lightning struggled against it at low altitude. Hare remembered the stories. Pilots returning from Coral Sea with bullet holes stitched across their wings. Men who'd watched their wingmen spiral into the ocean, unable to outmaneuver the Zeros that danced around them like wasps. The Japanese pilots called Americans kakujitsu, overripe fruit, ready to fall. But the Hellcat was different. Hare felt it in every control surface response, every pound of armor plating beneath his seat. When Grumman engineer Leroy Grumman had put pencil to paper in 1941, he'd had one mission: build a fighter that could beat the Zero at its own game. Not by matching it, but by overwhelming it. The Zeros came in fast, their formations tight and disciplined. Hare could see the lead pilot's aircraft now, the distinctive red circle on its fuselage, the greenhouse canopy glinting in the sun. The Japanese formation began to split, executing a classic Chutai maneuver designed to envelope the American fighters from multiple angles. Here they come. Arm your guns and stay with your wingmen. Hare's thumb moved to the firing button. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns sat in his wings, loaded with 400 rounds per gun. That was 2,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, each bullet capable of punching through the Zero's thin aluminum skin like paper. The Wildcat had carried only 4 guns. The Hellcat's firepower was devastating by comparison. The first Zero committed to its attack run, diving toward Hare's wingman, Lieutenant, junior grade, Alex Vreeshu. The Japanese pilot was good, his dive angle was perfect, his deflection calculated. But he'd made one fatal assumption, that the American fighter would try to turn with him. Vreeshu didn't turn. He couldn't, not like a Zero could. Instead, he rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a high G barrel roll, using the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio to maintain his energy. The Zero followed, its pilot convinced he had the advantage. Hare lined up his shot. The computing gun sight, another innovation the Japanese lacked, automatically calculated lead and deflection. At 300 yards, he pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic, a hammering roar that drowned out even the engine. Tracers arced through the sky, and Hare watched them walk directly into the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. Not caught fire, not trailed smoke, disintegrated. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away like confetti. The canopy shattered. In less than 2 seconds, the Zero transformed from a lethal weapon into falling debris. The Japanese pilot never saw it coming. He'd been trained to fight Wildcats, slow, poorly armed, vulnerable. The Hellcat was something else entirely. Around Hare, the sky erupted into chaos. 7 more Hellcats engaged the remaining Zeros, and the mathematics of air combat began to assert themselves with brutal efficiency. Every advantage the Zero had once possessed, its lightness, its maneuverability, its range, now worked against it. The Hellcat pilots didn't try to dogfight. They used tactics developed at the Fighter Director School in Hawaii, tactics built around the Hellcat's strengths, diving attacks, high-speed slashing runs, mutual support. A second Zero exploded under Vreeshu's guns. A third tried to escape into a cloud bank but was intercepted by Lieutenant J.G. Harris Mitchell, who raked it from tail to engine cowling with a sustained burst. The Japanese formation was falling apart. Lieutenant Commander Hare pulled his Hellcat into a climbing spiral, gaining altitude while keeping his eyes locked on the swirling dogfight below. His tactical training kicked in: never get slow, never get low, never fight the Zeros fight. 2 more Japanese fighters had already fallen, trailing black smoke into the Pacific. The remaining Zeros were scattering, their formation discipline evaporating. One Zero pilot, either braver or more foolish than the others, decided to challenge a hare directly. The aircraft pulled up into a vertical climb, attempting the classic Zero maneuver that had killed so many American pilots, the yo-yo. Climb vertical, bleed the enemy's speed, then hammerhead turn and drop back down on his tail. It had worked against every American fighter the Japanese had encountered. A hare watched the Zero climb, tracking it through his canopy. At 15,000 feet, the Japanese fighter began to slow, its nose pointing almost straight up. The pilot was expecting a hare to follow, to try matching the climb, to stall out and become an easy target. Instead, a hare did something the Zero pilot couldn't comprehend. He pushed his throttle to war emergency power and kept climbing, not just matching the Zero's climb, but exceeding it. The Hellcat's massive engine, fuel injected and supercharged, gulped air and kept pulling. At 16,000 feet, a hare was still accelerating. At 17,000, he was directly behind the Zero, which had begun to hang on its propeller, nearly stationary in the air. The Japanese pilot's face was visible through his canopy, his head turning, his eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. American fighters were supposed to be inferior at altitude, supposed to be underpowered, supposed to fall away. A hare's gun spoke again. The Zero, already at stall speed, had nowhere to go. The burst caught it in the engine and cockpit. The fighter seemed to pause in mid-air, then fell away in a spin, trailing flame. 3 miles to the east, Alex Vreeshu was learning the same lesson the hard way, but learning it successfully. A Zero had latched onto his tail, the Japanese pilot expertly matching every turn, every roll. Vreeshu could feel the GS pressing him into his seat as he yanked the stick, trying to break the lock. His G-suit, another piece of equipment the Japanese lacked, kept blood from pooling in his legs, keeping him conscious through maneuvers that would have blacked out a Zero pilot. 3. You've got 1 on your 6. Brake right, brake right. Vreeshu broke hard right, but the Zero followed, its pilot showing the kind of skill that had made Japanese naval aviators legendary. The distance was closing. Vreeshu could see traces flickering past his canopy, 20mm cannon fire from the Zero's wing-mounted guns. The Japanese fighter only had 60 rounds per cannon, but that was enough if the pilot was accurate. Then Vreeshu did something that seemed suicidal. He chopped his throttle and dropped his flaps. The Hellcat's speed bled off instantly. The Zero, traveling at over 300 knots, couldn't slow down fast enough. It shot past Vreeshu's nose like a dart, the Japanese pilot's face turning in shock as he realized his mistake. Vreeshu retracted his flaps, slammed the throttle forward, and rolled in behind the Zero. The Japanese pilot tried to turn. The Zero could outturn anything in the sky, but turning requires energy, and energy requires time. Vreeshu gave him neither. At 200 yards, he fired a 2-second burst. The Zero's unarmored fuel tanks erupted in flame. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the ocean, trailing a comet's tail of fire. The engagement had lasted 4 minutes. Of the 12 Zeros that had attacked, 9 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Not a single Hellcat had been lost. 1 had taken hits in the wing, testimony to the Zero's deadly armament, but the pilot, Ensign John Strain, was already heading back toward the carrier Essex, his self-sealing fuel tanks having prevented what would have been a catastrophic fire in any earlier American fighter. As a hare formed up his squadron for the return flight, he keyed his radio. All aircraft, check in. 2, checking in. 2 kills confirmed. 3, checking in. Got 1. Maybe 2. 4, checking in. Splashed 1 confirmed. The voices continued. When the count was finished, VF2 had claimed 11 confirmed kills and 1 probable. The mathematics were stunning. An 11-to-0 kill ratio in a single engagement. But a hare knew this wasn't luck. This was design. This was engineering. This was the result of thousands of hours of testing at Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island facility, where engineers had studied captured Zero fragments, interviewed surviving pilots, and built a fighter specifically to counter every Japanese advantage. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, over 12,000 pounds fully loaded compared to the Zero's 6,000. But that weight was armor plate protecting the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't ignite from a single bullet, and structural reinforcement that could absorb punishment that would tear a Zero apart. The Hellcat could dive at over 450 knots without the wings tearing off. The Zero's maximum dive speed was barely 360 knots before structural failure became a risk. The Hellcat climbed faster above 10,000 feet. It dove faster at any altitude. It could sustain high-G maneuvers longer. And its 6.50 caliber guns delivered a weight of fire that could literally disintegrate an enemy aircraft in seconds. Below, on Tarawa, Marines were still fighting for every yard of blood-soaked coral. But above, the balance of air power in the Pacific had just shifted irrevocably. The Japanese pilots who had mocked the Hellcat as just another clumsy American fighter were learning a terrible truth. They weren't fighting a better Zero. They were fighting something that had made the Zero obsolete. 18 months earlier, Bethpage, Long Island, New York. Leroy Grumman stood in the cavernous assembly hall of Plant No. 2, watching workers rivet aluminum sheets onto the prototype that would change the Pacific War. Outside, snow fell across Long Island. It was February 1942, and America was reeling. Pearl Harbor was 2 months past. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had surrendered. And in the skies over the Pacific, Japanese Zeros were slaughtering American pilots with impunity. Grumman held a thick folder in his hands, combat reports from survivors of the raids on Pearl Harbor, from pilots who'd flown at the Battle of the Coral Sea, from Marine aviators who'd held the line at Guadalcanal. Every report told the same story. The F4F Wildcat, Grumman's own design, was outmatched. Brave men were dying in aircraft that couldn't compete. "We need more speed at altitude," Grumman said to his chief engineer, Bill Schwendler, pointing to a diagram pinned to the wall. "The Zero dominates above 15,000 feet. Our boys can't catch them, can't climb with them." Schwendler nodded, his pencil already marking calculations on a notepad. "The R2800 engine will give us the power. 2,000 horsepower versus the Zero's 1,000. But we adding 1,000 pounds just in armor and self-sealing tanks." "Then we add it," Grumman said flatly. "I'm not sending pilots up in flying coffins anymore. Every Hellcat comes home, or it goes down fighting, not because a single lucky bullet hit the fuel tank." The prototype before them, designated XF6F1, looked brutal compared to the graceful Zero. Where the Japanese fighter was sleek and minimalist, the Hellcat was thick-bodied, aggressive, predatory. Its engine cowling bulged around the massive Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp. Its wings were broader, stronger, designed to carry the weight of 6 heavy machine guns instead of the Wildcat's 4. But Grumman's real innovation wasn't visible from the outside. It was in the philosophy. The Zero had been designed by Jiro Horikoshi as a pure fighter, lightweight, agile, perfect for the opening moves of war when Japan's pilots were the best trained in the world. But Horikoshi had made a fatal assumption, that Japanese pilot quality would remain constant, that the war would be short, that losses could be replaced. Grumman designed the Hellcat for a different war. A long war. A war of attrition where pilots would be hastily trained, where aircraft would take battle damage and need to survive, where superior numbers and industrial capacity would matter more than individual artistry. The Hellcat was designed to be flown by average pilots and still win. In the hands of excellent pilots, it would be devastating. "How's the roll rate?" Grumman asked. "Better than the Zero at high speed," Schwendler replied. "At 300 knots, we can outroll them easily. They have to slow down to turn, and when they slow down, they die." Grumman walked around the prototype, running his hand along the wing. 3.50 caliber Brownings were mounted in each wing, their ammunition belts feeding from boxes behind the pilot. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. When all 6 fired together, they delivered 4,800 rounds per minute, a storm of lead that could destroy a bomber in seconds, let alone a light Libel fighter. "What about the gun sight?" Grumman asked. "Mark 8 computing sight, same as we're putting in the new Corsairs," Schwendler said. "Gyroscopic. Automatically calculates deflection based on target angle and range. The pilot just has to keep the pipper on target. The sight does the math." Grumman nodded. Another advantage. Zero pilots relied on instinct and experience, calculating deflection shots in their heads. American pilots would have a machine doing it for them. In a high-speed engagement where fractions of a second mattered, that edge could mean everything. "When can we fly it?" Grumman asked. "First flight scheduled for June 26th. If the tests go well, we can have production models rolling out by October." "Make it September," Grumman said. "Our boys are dying out there. Every month counts." June 26, 1942. Grumman Test Facility, Bethpage. Test pilot Robert Hall climbed into the XF6F1's cockpit for the first time, settling into the armored seat. The armor plate behind him was thick enough to stop a 20mm cannon shell, something no Japanese pilot could claim. The instrument panel was laid out logically, every gauge where it needed to be. The stick felt solid, responsive. Hall ran through his pre-flight checklist. Fuel, topped off with 250 gallons. Engine, the massive R2800 rumbled to life, its 18 cylinders firing in perfect harmony. Control surfaces, ailerons, elevator, rudder, all responding smoothly. He advanced the throttle and felt the Hellcat lurch forward. The aircraft was heavy, no question, almost 50% heavier than a Zero. But that weight was purposeful. It was armor. It was ammunition. It was survivability. The Hellcat accelerated down the runway, and Hall pulled back on the stick. The aircraft lifted cleanly, climbing away from Long Island with surprising agility for its size. Hall retracted the landing gear and kept climbing, pushing the Hellcat up to 10,000 feet. Then he put it through its paces. Bank left, responsive, solid. Bank right, the same. Hall pushed into a dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb past 400 knots. The Hellcat remained rock steady, no flutter, no buffeting. He pulled out of the dive, sustaining 6 GS, and the airframe didn't even groan. He tried a barrel roll, then an Immelman turn, then a series of high G brakes that would have torn the wings off a Zero. The Hellcat took it all without complaint. Hall keyed his radio. Bethpage Tower, this is Hall. Initial flight test complete. Performance exceeds specifications across the board. This aircraft is ready for combat. On the ground, Grumman allowed himself a rare smile. They had it. They finally had it. A fighter that could beat the Zero on every metric that mattered: speed, firepower, durability, high-altitude performance. The only thing the Zero retained was low-speed maneuverability, and Grumman's tactics would make sure American pilots never fought at low speed. But having the aircraft was only half the battle. Now they had to build them, thousands of them, and get them into the hands of Navy pilots before the Japanese advance could be stopped. The race was on. September 1942. Naval Air Station Punine, Maui, Hawaii. Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch stood in front of 40 Navy pilots, a chalkboard behind him covered in diagrams that looked more like football plays than air combat tactics. The men before him were young, most barely in their 20s, and their faces showed the weariness of pilots who'd already seen combat. Some had flown at Midway, others at Coral Sea. All of them had fought Zeros, and all of them had watched friends die. "Forget everything you think you know about dogfighting," Thatch said, tapping the chalkboard with his pointer. "The Zero can outturn you. Accept it. If you try to turn with a Zero, you're dead. But if you fight smart, the Zero pilot is dead instead." He drew 2 circles on the board, representing 2 American fighters flying in formation. Then he drew arrows showing them crossing paths, weaving back and forth like scissors blades. "This is the Thatch weave," he continued. "You fly in pairs, always in pairs. When a Zero gets on your tail, you don't try to shake him. You call your wingman, and you cross. The Zero follows you, and suddenly he's flying into your wingman's guns. He has 2 choices, break off or die." Lieutenant Edward Whitey Faitner, who'd survived 3 months of combat flying Wildcats, raised his hand. "Commander, what about the new aircraft? Are we really getting something that can match the Zero?" Thatch's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close. "Better than match it, Whitey. The Hellcat arrives next month. And when it does, everything changes." He pulled back a canvas tarp covering a scale model on the table beside him. The assembled pilots leaned forward, studying the thick-bodied fighter with its distinctive bubble canopy and wide-track landing gear. "Grumman F6F Hellcat," Thatch said. "Heavier, faster, tougher than anything we've flown. 6.50 cals. Armor plate. Self-sealing tanks. And most importantly, it's faster than a Zero at altitude, and it can outdive anything the Japanese have." "Can it tame with them?" someone asked. "No," Thatch said bluntly. "And you won't try to. The Hellcat isn't designed for turning dogfights. It's designed for boom and zoom tactics. You dive on them from above, make one high-speed pass, and if you don't kill them, you climb away. They can't follow. Their engines starve for oxygen above 20,000 feet. Ours don't. You maintain your energy, maintain your altitude, and you kill them on your terms, not theirs." Thatch spent the next 3 hours drilling the new tactics into his pilots. The Thatch weave was just the foundation. There was also the rolling scissors, the high-side gun pass, the overhead yo-yo. Every maneuver was designed around a single principle: never fight the Zero's fight. Use superior speed, superior firepower, and superior teamwork to negate the Zero's advantages. The Japanese train their pilots for individual combat, Thatch explained. Their best pilots are artists. They can do things with an aircraft that seem impossible. But they fight alone. We fight as teams. 2 Hellcats working together will beat any number of Zeros as long as you stick to the doctrine. Faitner studied the diagrams, his mind already racing through scenarios. What if they try to rope-a-dope us? Fly low and slow, try to drag us into a turning fight. You don't take the bait, Thatch said. You maintain altitude. If they won't come up to you, you wait. Eventually they have to either attack or go home. When they attack, they have to climb. And when they climb, they are slow, vulnerable, and dead. January 16, 1943. USS Essex, somewhere in the Pacific. The first operational Hellcats were lowered onto the deck of the Essex by crane, their wings folded for storage. Lieutenant Commander Edward H. Butcher Hare, already an ace from his Wildcat days, walked the deck, inspecting the new fighters with the eye of a man whose life would depend on them. The Hellcat was bigger than he'd expected. Not bigger than a Corsair, but substantial. He climbed up onto the wing and peed into the cockpit. The seat was positioned higher than in the Wildcat, giving better visibility. The instrument panel was clean, logical. The stick grip housed the gun trigger and radio controls exactly where his thumb would naturally fall. "What do you think, Butch?" asked Lieutenant Alex Vrashu, climbing up beside him. "I think I want to take it up right now," Hare said. "But the skipper says we wait until tomorrow. Full briefing, full checkout." The briefing came at 0600 hours the next morning. Commander David McCampbell, the newly appointed Air Group Commander, stood before the assembled pilots of VF-9, the first squadron to receive Hellcats. "Gentlemen, this is not a Wildcat with a bigger engine," McCampbell began. "This is a completely different aircraft that requires a completely different mindset. The Wildcat was a defensive fighter. You flew it to protect the fleet, to hold the line. The Hellcat is an offensive weapon. You fly it to seek out and destroy enemy aircraft." He outlined the specifications: maximum speed of 380 miles per hour at 17,300 feet. Service ceiling of 37,300 feet. Rate of climb, 3,410 feet per minute. Combat range, 945 miles. The numbers were impressive, but McCampbell emphasized the intangibles. "The Hellcat can take punishment like nothing you've flown before," he said. "I've seen test reports where they put 200 rounds into a Hellcat's A-frame and it still flew home. The armor works. The self-sealing tanks work. You can take hits that would have killed you in a Wildcat and keep fighting." He paused, making eye contact with each pilot. "But here's what matters most: the Hellcat gives you options. If you're losing an engagement, you can break off. The Zero can't catch you in a dive. If you're outnumbered, you can climb away. They can't follow above 25,000 feet. For the first time in this war, you get to choose when and how you fight. Use that advantage." Hare's first flight in a Hellcat came that afternoon. He strapped in, ran through the checklist, and fired up the R-2800. The engine's roar was deeper, more powerful than the Wildcats. He taxied to the catapult, locked into position, and waited for the launch signal. The catapult officer's flag dropped. The catapult fired. Hare was slammed back into his seat as the Hellcat shot forward, accelerating from 0 to 90 knots in less than 2 seconds. Then he was airborne, climbing away from the Essex with the Pacific spreading out blue and endless beneath him. He pulled back on the stick, pointing the nose skyward, and watched the altimeter spin. 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000. At 20,000 feet, he leveled off and put the Hellcat through a series of maneuvers. Rolls, loops, high G turns. The aircraft responded precisely, predictably. There was none of the Wildcat's tendency to wobble in a hard turn, none of the control heaviness at high speed. Hare pushed into a dive, watching the airspeed climb past 400 knots. The Hellcat was rock solid. He tried a high-speed roll, something that would have been suicidal in a Wildcat. The Hellcat snapped through the roll cleanly. Then he tested the guns. He toggled the arming switch and pressed the trigger for 1 second burst. All 6.50 calibers roared to life, and the Hellcat shuddered with recoil. Tracers arced away into the distance. In that 1 second, he'd fired 80 rounds. The destructive power was staggering. When Hare landed back on the Essex, he climbed out of the cockpit with a grin splitting his face. Well, Vraishu asked. We're going to kill a lot of Japanese with this thing, Ahaz said. August 31st, 1943. 240 miles northwest of Marcus Island. The ready room aboard USS Yorktown was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Lieutenant J.G. Hamilton McWhirter sat with 11 other pilots from VF-5, listening to the intelligence officer outline their first combat mission in the Hellcat. On the map behind him, Marcus Island, a tiny speck of coral and concrete that the Japanese had transformed into an airfield, was circled in red. Expect 20 to 30 Japanese aircraft, the intelligence officer said, tapping the map with his pointer. Mostly Zeros, possibly some Betty bombers. They've been harassing our reconnaissance flights for 2 weeks. Your job is to sweep the area clean and provide cover for the bombing strike. McWhirter felt his stomach tighten. He'd flown Wildcats at Guadalcanal, had survived 6 months of brutal combat where every mission felt like rolling dice with death. He'd seen the Hellcat's specifications, had trained in it for 3 weeks, but numbers on paper meant nothing until you faced an enemy who was trying to kill you. Commander Charles Crommelin, VF-5's commanding officer, stood up. Remember your training. Stay in pairs. Maintain altitude advantage. Don't get sucked into turning dogfights. The Hellcat gives you every advantage except low-speed maneuverability. Don't throw those advantages away trying to prove you're a better pilot than the Japanese. You're not here to win style points. You're here to kill enemy aircraft and come home alive. At 0645 hours, 12 Hellcats launched from Yorktown's deck, formed up, and headed northwest toward Marcus Island. McWhirter flew as wingman to Lieutenant Commander Crommelin, holding position 200 feet off his starboard wing. The morning sun was behind them, another tactical advantage. Attack from out of the sun, and your enemy doesn't see you coming until it's too late. The flight took 90 minutes. As they approached Marcus Island, McWhirter could see the distinctive outline of the airfield, a single runway carved across the coral, with revetments and buildings clustered at the southern end. And climbing to meet them, like angry hornets from a kicked nest, were the Zeros. Tallahassee. Bandits at 10 o'clock, climbing through 10,000 feet. Count 16, 18 aircraft. Crommelin's voice came through calm and steady. Arm guns. Switch to combat spread. We take them from above. The 12 Hellcats separated into 6 two-plane elements, gaining altitude. The Zeros continued climbing, their pilots eager to engage. They were expecting Wildcats, slow, vulnerable, easy prey. What they got was something entirely different. At 18,000 feet, Crommelin rolled inverted and pulled through into a dive. McWhirter followed, his thumb moving to the trigger. The computing gun sight came alive, the illuminated pipper dancing across the canopy as it tracked the nearest Zero. The Japanese formation was still climbing, still organized, still confident. That confidence lasted exactly 5 more seconds. Crommelin's Hellcat screamed down at over 400 knots, too fast for the Zeros to react. His 6.50 calibers opened fire at 400 yards. The target Zero, its pilot still looking upward, searching for the Americans, simply came apart. Wings folded. Fuselage ruptured. The aircraft tumbled from the sky in pieces. McWhirter picked his target, a Zero on the right edge of the formation. He centered the pipper, led the target slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The Hellcat's guns hammered, and he watched his tracers walk into the Zero's engine. Smoke erupted. The Zero rolled left, trying to evade, but McWhirter followed, firing another burst. This time the Zero's fuel tank ignited. The aircraft became a fireball, dropping away trailing black smoke. McWhirter's first kill in a Hellcat had taken less than 10 seconds. Around him, the sky transformed into chaos. The remaining Zeros scattered, their formation shattered by the devastating opening attack. Japanese pilots tried to execute the maneuvers that had worked so well against Wildcats, tight turns, vertical climbs, aerobatic evasions. But the Hellcat pilots didn't chase. They didn't follow Zeros into turning fights. They stayed fast, stayed high, and used boom and zoom tactics exactly as trained. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, flying in the second element, demonstrated the new doctrine perfectly. A Zero latched onto his tail, the Japanese pilot executing a beautiful chandelle turn to get into firing position. Valencia didn't try to shake him. Instead, he called his wingman, Ensign Clinton Smith. 4, I've got one on my 6. Crossing right. Roger, I've got him. Valencia broke hard right, crossing in front of Smith's nose. The Zero followed, its pilot focused entirely on Valencia. Smith pulled lead, fired a 2-second burst, and the Zero disintegrated under the concentrated fire of 6.50 calibers. The pilot never saw Smith coming. The thatch weave, designed in a classroom in Hawaii, practiced over Maui, worked flawlessly in combat. Another Zero tried the classic Japanese tactic of climbing vertical, attempting to stall out an American pursuer. Ensign Robert Duncan followed, but unlike in a Wildcat, he didn't stall. The Hellcat's powerful engine kept pulling, kept climbing. At 22,000 feet, Duncan was still behind the Zero, still accelerating. The Japanese pilot looked back in horror as Duncan closed to 200 yards and fired. The Zero fell away, trailing parts and pieces. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. When it was over, VF5 had shot down 11 Zeros confirmed and damaged 4 more. Not a single Hellcat was lost. 2 had taken minor damage, bullet holes in wings and tail surfaces, but both aircraft returned safely to the Yorktown. In the ready room debriefing, the pilots were almost giddy with disbelief. "It's not even fair," McWhirter said, accepting a cup of coffee from the ship's steward. "The Zeros can't compete. They are too light, too fragile. One good burst and they just come apart." "Don't get overconfident," Crumlin warned. "The Japanese pilots aren't stupid. They'll adapt. They'll find our weaknesses." But Crumlin was wrong about one thing: there weren't many weaknesses to find. The Hellcat had been designed specifically to counter every Japanese advantage, and that design was proving devastatingly effective. September 18, 1943. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Truk Lagoon. Commander Minoru Genda sat in the briefing room, reading combat reports from Marcus Island, from Rabaul, from the Solomon Islands. The reports told a disturbing story. American pilots were no longer easy targets. Their new fighter, intelligence identified it as the F6F Hellcat, was achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. They refused to engage in turning combat, one report stated. They attack from high altitude at high speed, make one pass, and climb away. Our pilots cannot follow. Attempts to bait them into low-altitude combat have failed. Another report. The new American fighter is heavily armored. Multiple hits from 7.7mm machine guns produce no effect. Even 20mm cannon hits often fail to bring down the aircraft. Meanwhile, their .50 caliber guns are devastating. A single burst can destroy a Zero. Genda set down the reports and looked at the assembled officers. These were experienced men, veterans of Pearl Harbor, of the Indian Ocean raids, of the early victories. Now their faces showed concern. "The Americans have learned from their mistakes," Genda said quietly. "They've built an aircraft that negates our advantages and exploits our weaknesses. The Zero was designed for a short war with highly skilled pilots. We now in a long war, and our pilot quality is declining while theirs is improving." "What do we do?" asked Commander Tokeo Shibata. Genda had no good answer. The A6M variant was in production with slightly better performance, but it was still fundamentally the same aircraft, light, unarmored, vulnerable. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to design and produce an entirely new fighter. They were stuck with the Zero. "We adapt our tactics," Genda finally said. "We avoid high-altitude combat. We use superior numbers. We focus on attacking their bombers, not their fighters." But everyone in the room knew the truth. Those weren't tactics for victory. Those were tactics for survival. June 19, 1944. 135 miles west of Guam, Philippine Sea. Commander David McCampbell stood in USS Essex's Combat Information Center watching the radar screen with mounting anticipation. The young radar operator's hand trembled slightly as he pointed to the display, where dozens of green blips had suddenly appeared, moving east toward the American fleet. "Sir, we're picking up a massive raid. Bearing 265 degrees, range 140 miles. Count shows." "Jesus, sir. At least 70 aircraft, maybe more. Second wave forming behind them. Third wave behind that." McCampbell felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. "Sound general quarters. Launch all fighters. This is it, gentlemen. This is what we've been waiting for." 8 months had passed since the Hellcat's combat debut. 8 months of island-hopping campaigns, of strikes on Rabaul, of grinding attrition warfare across the Pacific. In that time, the Hellcat had proven itself beyond any doubt. Kill ratios consistently exceeded 10 to 1. Some squadrons were achieving 15:1 or even 20:1. But this would be something different. The Japanese were throwing everything they had left at the American invasion fleet off Saipan. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet had launched 373 aircraft, Zeros, Vals, Judys, Kates, every remaining carrier-based aircraft the Imperial Japanese Navy could muster. It was a desperate gamble, a final attempt to destroy the American carriers before Japan's inner defensive perimeter collapsed entirely. Against them, the U.S. Navy would launch 450 Hellcats. McCampbell raced to the flight deck, where his Hellcat sat armed and fueled, the number 13 painted on its fuselage. Around him, the Essex erupted into controlled chaos. Plane handlers pushed aircraft into launch positions. Pilots sprinted from ready rooms. The ship's catapults began firing, hurling Hellcat after Hellcat into the sky. Within 20 minutes, 30 Hellcats from Essex were airborne and climbing. McCampbell led his division to 25,000 feet, positioning them between the incoming Japanese formations and the fleet. To his left and right, formations from Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, and a dozen other carriers were doing the same, building a defensive wall of Hellcats that stretched for 60 miles. All units, this is Blackjack, came the voice of the fighter director-controller. Raid consists of multiple waves. First wave now at 120 miles, Angels 12, heading 090. Vector 270. Buster. The last word, Buster, meant full throttle. McCampbell pushed his throttle forward and felt the familiar surge of power. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat supercharger was working perfectly, feeding compressed air to the R2800 engine. Below, he could see the ocean, dotted with the gray shapes of the American task force, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, dozens of destroyers. 40,000 men counting on the Hellcat pilots above them. Tally-ho! Bandits at 2 o'clock low, range 20 miles. They are climbing. McCampbell spotted them, a formation of at least 40 Japanese aircraft in a ragged V formation. Zeros providing top cover for Val dive bombers below. The Japanese were climbing, trying to reach 15,000 feet before attacking. They never made it. Tally, tally. All units engage. Remember your training, boom and zoom, no turning fights. McCampbell rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a vertical dive. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, followed. The computing gun sight locked onto a Zero at the formation's edge. McCampbell waited until 400 yards, then pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns fired. Tracers converged on the Zero, which exploded spectacularly, its unarmored fuel tank igniting. McCampbell didn't watch it fall. He was already lining up his second target, a Val dive bomber trying to push over into its attack dive. He fired a 3-second burst. The Val's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled onto its back and plunged toward the ocean, trailing smoke. All around McCampbell, the sky had become a shooting gallery. Hellcats dove through the Japanese formation like sharks through a school of fish. Every pass resulted in kills. The Japanese pilots were trying to maintain formation, trying to reach the fleet, but they were being slaughtered. Lieutenant Alexander Vreeshuh, flying with VF-16 from Lexington, found himself in the perfect position, 5,000 feet above a formation of 18 Judy dive bombers. The bombers were flying in neat 3-plane sections, their pilots focused on navigating toward the American ships below. Their Zero escorts had already been drawn away by other Hellcat formations. Vreeshuh rolled into his attack. He selected the trailing Judy and fired a short burst. The bomber's right wing folded upward and tore away. The aircraft spun into the ocean. Vreeshuh shifted to the next target. Another burst. This Judy's engine exploded, and the aircraft nose-dived. Target 3. Target 4. Target 5. Vreeshuh's gun camera captured the carnage. In less than 8 minutes, he shot down 6 Japanese bombers. When his guns finally ran dry, 2,400 rounds exhausted, he radioed back to Lexington, 6 Judys splashed. Winchester. Winchester, the code word meaning out of ammunition. The radio net was filled with similar reports. Scratch 3 Zeros. Got 2 Vals. For bandits down, still engaging. The first Japanese wave was annihilated. Of the 70 aircraft that had launched, fewer than 20 reached the American fleet. Those 20 faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the task force. Only one bomb hit, a minor strike on the battleship South Dakota that caused minimal damage. Not a single American carrier was touched. But the Japanese weren't finished. Admiral Ozawa launched a second wave, 128 aircraft. Then a third wave, 47 aircraft. Then a fourth, 82 aircraft. Over 300 aircraft thrown at the American fleet in successive waves. Every wave met the same fate. McCampbell landed back on Essex only long enough to refuel and rearm. He launched again at 1,300 hours, this time intercepting the third wave 70 miles from the fleet. His division caught a formation of Zeros and Jills, torpedo bombers, at 18,000 feet. The Zeros tried to protect their charges, but they were outmatched. McCampbell used the classic Hellcat tactic: high side pass, fire, extend away, climb back to altitude, repeat. Each pass resulted in a kill or heavily damaged aircraft. The Zeros couldn't follow him in the climbs. They couldn't catch him in the dives. They could only watch as their torpedo bombers were picked apart. By 15:30 hours, the battle was over. The Japanese had lost 243 aircraft, over 65% of everything they'd launched. American losses, 30 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents and anti-aircraft fire. Only a handful had fallen in air-to-air combat. The pilots returning to their carriers were euphoric. They dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese aircraft had been as easy to shoot down as turkeys. In the ready rooms and on the flight decks, the kill claims were tallied. McCampbell had 9 kills. Vrashu had 6. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb had 7. The numbers were staggering. But there was no time to celebrate. That night, Admiral Spruance made a fateful decision: pursue a Zoas retreating fleet and finish the job. June 20th, 1944. 275 miles northwest of Guam. Lieutenant J.G. George Blair sat in his Hellcat on USS Hornet's flight deck, watching the sun descend toward the western horizon. It was 1,620 hours, late in the day, to be launching a strike. Admiral Mitchell had finally located the retreating Japanese fleet, but the target was 275 miles away. That meant a 550-mile round trip, most of the return flight in darkness, and every pilot knew what that meant. Even if they survived combat, landing on a carrier at night with low fuel was nearly as dangerous as facing the enemy. "All pilots, this is the Admiral," came Mitch's voice over the ready room speakers. "I know the odds. I know it's late. But we have a chance to end Japanese carrier aviation today. If we don't take this chance, these carriers will rebuild and we'll face them again. Launch immediately." Blair's hands tightened on the stick. He'd flown in the turkey shoot yesterday, had shot down 2 Zeros and a Judy. He'd been lucky. His Hellcat had taken only a single 7.7mm hit in the tail that barely dented the armor. But this mission felt different. This felt desperate. The catapult fired. Blair shot forward and climbed away from the Hornet, forming up with 11 other Hellcats from VF-2. Behind them, dive bombers and torpedo bombers launched, followed by more fighters. In total, 216 aircraft headed west into the dying sun, chasing a fleet that didn't want to be caught. The flight out took 90 minutes. Blair watched his fuel gauge creep downward. The Hellcat's range was excellent, 945 miles on internal fuel, but this mission was pushing the limits. By the time they reached the Japanese fleet, they'd have maybe 4 to 5 minutes of combat fuel remaining. After that, they'd be gliding. At 1840 hours, the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon. Admiral Ozawa had 6 carriers left, along with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the remnants of what had once been the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Now those carriers were launching their remaining aircraft in a final desperate defense. Perhaps 40 Japanese fighters rose to meet the American strike. They were outnumbered 5 to 1. But they fought anyway, because they had no choice, because their code demanded it, because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. Blair's division dove on a formation of Zeros protecting the carrier Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force. The Zeros turned to engage, their pilots executing the tight, spiraling turns that had once been so deadly. But the Hellcat pilots had learned. They didn't follow into the turns. They made one high-speed pass, extended away, and climbed for another attack. Blair centered his gun sight on a Zero attempting a head-on pass, a tactic of pure desperation. Both aircraft fired simultaneously. Blair felt impacts, 20mm shells hitting his right wing and engine cowling. Oil spattered across his windscreen. But his 6.50 calibers struck home first. The Zero's engine disintegrated. The aircraft tumbled past Blair's canopy, so close he could see the pilot's face, young, perhaps 19, eyes wide with the knowledge of death. Blair's engine was running rough, the oil pressure dropping. He had to break off. But as he climbed away from the fleet, he saw what the dive bombers and torpedo bombers had accomplished. The carrier Hyo was listing heavily, fires raging across its flight deck. The Zuikaku had taken multiple bomb hits. The oiler Genyo Maru was sinking. 2 other carriers were damaged. Japanese carrier aviation wasn't just defeated. It was effectively destroyed. All aircraft, this is strike leader. Disengage and return to base. I repeat, disengage and return to base. Blair turned east, nursing his damaged Hellcat toward home. The sun had set now, and darkness was closing in fast. His fuel gauge showed 50 gallons remaining, maybe 20 minutes of flight time. The carriers were still 250 miles away. Around him, dozens of aircraft were in the same predicament. Hellcats, Dauntless, Avengers, all limping home with battle damage and critically low fuel. The radio net filled with worried voices. This is Sunshine 4-3. I'm down to fumes. Don't think I'll make it. Stay with it, 4-3. The fleet is lit up. You can see them from 50 miles. And it was true. Admiral Mitchell had made another fateful decision, turn on every light in the task force. Searchlights stabbed into the sky. Flight decks were illuminated. Destroyers fired star shells. It was a massive breach of blackout protocol. Any Japanese submarine in the area would have a field day. But Mitchell valued his pilots more than he feared submarines. Blair saw the lights at 40 miles. His fuel gauge was on empty, the engine coughing. He switched tanks, hoping for a few more drops. The engine caught again, sputtering but running. At 10 miles, he could make out individual carriers. At 5 miles, he spotted the Hornet. But there was a problem. Every carrier had aircraft in the landing pattern, some damaged, some low on fuel, all trying to land simultaneously. The normal careful orchestration of carrier operations had collapsed into organized chaos. Any Hellcat, any deck, came the call from the landing signal officers. If you can land, land. If you can't land, ditch close to a destroyer. Blair's engine quit at 3 miles. The propeller windmilled to a stop. He was gliding now, with one chance to get this right. The Hornet was directly ahead, its deck lights blazing. Blair lowered his landing gear manually, no hydraulic pressure, and lined up on the deck. He was coming in too fast with no power to adjust. The LSO gave him a frantic wave-off signal, but Blair was committed. He crossed the fantail 30 knots too fast, caught the number 3 wire, and slammed down hard enough to crack his head against the gun sight. Pain exploded behind his eyes, but he was down. He was alive. Around the fleet, the water was dotted with floating aircraft and parachutes. Destroyers raced to pick up survivors. Of the 216 aircraft that had launched, 20 were shot down in combat. 80 more ran out of fuel and ditched or crashed attempting to land. But the sacrifice had achieved its goal. Japanese carrier aviation was finished as an offensive force. October 24, 1944. Above the Philippine Sea, Battle of Leyte Gulf. The kill count was now over 4,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed by Hellcats. But the war wasn't over. As Commander David McCampbell launched from Essex for what would become his most famous mission, a new and terrible Japanese tactic was emerging, the kamikaze. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, were on a routine combat air patrol when they spotted a massive formation approaching the fleet. 60 aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, and bombers heading directly toward the invasion beaches at Leyte. Blackjack, this is McCampbell. We have a huge raid inbound. Request immediate support. McCampbell, support is 20 minutes out. You all we have. Do what you can. 2 Hellcats against 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell should have waited for support. Doctrine said wait. Common sense said wait. But those 60 aircraft were heading toward American ships filled with American sailors, and McCampbell knew that every minute counted. Roy, we going in. Hit them from above. Make every shot count. McCampbell dove into the Japanese formation from 20,000 feet. He selected a bomber on the formation's edge and fired a short burst. The bomber exploded. He shifted to a Zero, fired again, another kill. Third target, an Oscar fighter, disintegrated under his guns. The Japanese formation was so large and so densely packed that McCampbell couldn't miss. Every burst hit something. Every hit resulted in a kill or critical damage. He was in the zone. Every movement instinctive, every shot perfect. But now the Japanese were reacting. Zeros broke formation to engage him. McCampbell used every Hellcat advantage, speed, climb rate, firepower. He'd dive, kill, climb away before the Zeros could react. Then dive again, kill again, climb again. His ammunition counter spun down. 2,000 rounds. 1,500, 1,000. Each burst had to count. Roy Rushing's voice crackled over the radio, tight with tension. "Skipper, I'm Winchester. Guns are dry. Get clear, Roy. Head back to the ship." McCampbell was alone now, one Hellcat against what remained of the Japanese formation, still at least 40 aircraft. His ammunition counter read 600 rounds. That was enough for maybe 5 more kills if he was perfect. He had to be perfect. A Zero pulled up vertically, trying to loop back onto McCampbell's tail. McCampbell recognized the maneuver. It had killed dozens of American pilots in 1942. But this was 1944, and he was flying a Hellcat, not a Wildcat. He pulled vertical after the Zero, and his more powerful engine kept him in the fight. At the top of the loop, McCampbell was still accelerating while the Zero hung nearly motionless. He fired a 2-second burst. The Zero fell away, its pilot dead in the cockpit. Kill number 4. A Val dive bomber tried to escape into a cloud bank. McCampbell caught it before it could hide, firing from 300 yards. The Val's right wing folded, and the bomber spiraled into the ocean. Kill number 5. The Japanese formation was disintegrating now, the pilots rattled by the ferocity of McCampbell's assault. 2 Oscars broke away from the main group, heading for the deck, trying to escape at low altitude. McCampbell followed them down, pushing the Hellcat to 420 knots in the dive. He caught the trailing Oscar at 5,000 feet, fired a short burst. Kill 6. The second Oscar jinked hard left, and McCampbell followed, pulling 6 GS in the turn. His G-suit inflated, keeping blood from draining from his brain. The Oscar pilot blacked out from the G-forces. Japanese pilots had no G-suits. The Oscar rolled inverted and crashed into the ocean. Kill number 7. McCampbell's ammunition counter read 200 rounds. Maybe 1 more kill, maybe 2 if he was incredibly precise. But the main Japanese formation was still driving toward the American fleet. He delayed them, disrupted them, killed 7 of them, but 60-7 still left 53 aircraft capable of attacking the ships. Then he saw them, a squadron of Hellcats from Hornet, diving into the Japanese formation from 25,000 feet. Then another squadron from Wasp. The relief force had arrived. What happened next was systematic destruction. The fresh Hellcat squadrons tore through the Japanese formation with devastating efficiency. The Japanese pilots were exhausted, low on fuel, demoralized by McCampbell's lone assault. They tried to fight, but the mathematics of air combat were against them. Every Hellcat pilot had been drilled in the tactics that worked: maintain speed, maintain altitude, use teamwork, exploit the Hellcat's advantages. Within 15 minutes, 32 more Japanese aircraft had fallen. The survivors, fewer than 20, turned back, abandoning their mission. McCampbell, his ammunition exhausted, formed up with the relief force and headed back toward the Essex. His radio was filled with the excited chatter of pilots recounting their kills, but McCampbell was silent, his mind already shifting to the debrief, to the analysis, to preparing for the next mission. When he landed, his kill claims were verified by his gun camera and by Rushing's testimony: 9 aircraft destroyed, 7 confirmed, 2 probable. Combined with his earlier victories, McCampbell now had 34 confirmed kills, making him the Navy's top ace. But more importantly, his actions that day had saved an unknown number of American lives aboard the ships that formation would have attacked. In the ready room, as the intelligence officer tallied the day's results, the numbers told the story: 60 Japanese aircraft intercepted, 54 destroyed, 6 damaged. 0 American aircraft lost in air combat. 1 Hellcat, McCampbell's, had returned with every bullet expended in fuel for maybe 5 more minutes of flight. It was the Hellcat's war now, completely and utterly. February 16, 1945. Above Tokyo Bay, Lieutenant Carl Brown circled at 15,000 feet over Tokyo itself, watching the city spread out below like a detailed map. It would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, American fighters operating over the Japanese home islands with near impunity. But Task Force 58 was now launching strikes against Tokyo, and the Hellcats were sweeping aside what remained of Japanese air defenses like a broom clearing debris. The Japanese had tried everything. They'd developed new tactics, focusing on hit-and-run attacks rather than dogfighting. They'd introduced new aircraft like the J-2M Raiden and the N-1KJ Shiden, fighters with performance approaching the Hellcats. They'd even fielded rocket-powered interceptors in small numbers. None of it mattered. The Hellcat's dominance wasn't just about aircraft performance, it was about the entire system. American pilots were better trained. American factories were producing 4 Hellcats for every Japanese fighter. American carriers could operate with near immunity. And American tactics, refined over 3 years of combat, were simply superior. Brown spotted a Raiden interceptor climbing toward a formation of B-29s at 30,000 feet. The Raiden was fast, faster than a Hellcat at high altitude. But Brown had altitude on it, and altitude meant energy, and energy meant life. He rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a diving attack. The Raiden pilot never saw him coming. By the time he noticed the Hellcat, Brown was already firing. The 6.50 calibers struck the Raiden's engine and cockpit. The Japanese fighter rolled over and plunged toward Tokyo Bay, trailing white smoke. It was Brown's 18th kill. By the standards of 1942, that would have made him an elite ace. By the standards of 1945, he was merely above average. There were dozens of Hellcat pilots with more kills. The aircraft had made aces common. August 15, 1945. USS Yorktown, off the coast of Japan. Commander Herbert Hauck sat in his Hellcat on the deck of Yorktown, ready to launch on what was supposed to be a strike against targets near Tokyo. The engine was running, the guns were armed, the mission was planned. Then the radio crackled to life. All aircraft, this is Task Force Commander. Stand down. Repeat, stand down. Hostilities have ceased. Japan has surrendered. For a moment, Hauck didn't process the words. Stand down. After 4 years of war, after tens of thousands of sorties, after 5,156 confirmed kills by Hellcats alone, it was just over? He shut down his engine and climbed out of the cockpit. Around him, other pilots were doing the same, their faces showing confusion, relief, disbelief. Some were cheering. Others were silent, processing the magnitude of the moment. The Hellcat had achieved what no other aircraft in history had accomplished, complete and utter air superiority over a determined enemy. Its 19-to-1 kill ratio was unprecedented. Its 75% share of all Navy air victories was staggering. From its combat debut in September 1943 to the end of the war in August 1945, the Hellcat had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. But the numbers didn't capture the full story. The Hellcat had done something more important than rack up impressive statistics. It had broken the myth of Japanese invincibility. It had protected American carriers, allowing them to project power across the Pacific. It had provided air cover for amphibious assaults from Tarawa to Okinawa. It had shot down so many experienced Japanese pilots that Japan's Air Force, by 1945, was manned largely by teenagers with barely 100 hours of flight time. The Japanese pilots who had mocked the Hellcat in 1943, who had dismissed it as just another clumsy American fighter, who had believed that Japanese skill and spirit would prevail, those pilots were almost all dead now. Shot down by the aircraft they'd underestimated, by the pilots they'd mocked, by the industrial system they'd challenged. September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay, aboard USS Missouri. From the flight deck of the Essex, anchored 3 miles from the Missouri, David McCampbell watched through binoculars as Japanese officials climbed aboard the battleship to sign the surrender documents. Above, a formation of 450 aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, B-29s, flew in precise formation, a demonstration of the overwhelming power that had brought Japan to its knees. McCampbell lowered his binoculars and walked across the deck to his Hellcat, number 13, the same aircraft in which he'd scored many of his 34 kills. The ground crew had already begun preparing it for the flight home, back to the United States, back to peacetime, back to a world where the Hellcat would no longer be needed. He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the patches where battle damage had been repaired, the rivets that held the armor plating in place, the gun ports that had delivered so much destruction. This aircraft had saved his life a dozen times. The armor had stopped bullets that would have killed him. The self-sealing tanks had prevented fires that would have sent him into the ocean. The powerful engine had pulled him out of situations that would have been fatal in a Wildcat. She's a hell of a machine, isn't she, Skipper? McCampbell turned to see Alex Vrashu approaching, his own flight jacket decorated with rows of kill markings, 19 confirmed victories, one of the Navy's top aces. Best fighter of the war, McCampbell said. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, but the best where it counted, survivability, firepower, reliability. Vrashu nodded, looking out over the dozens of Hellcats parked on Essex's deck. You know what the Japanese called it? Gyurenman no Totetsu. Grumman's iron. They said our fighters were made of iron while theirs were made of bamboo. By the end, they weren't far wrong. The comparison was apartment. The Zero had been designed as a lightweight superiority fighter, maximizing performance at the expense of everything else. No armor. No self-sealing tanks. Fragile structure. It had been perfect for 1941, when Japan had the best-trained pilots in the world and expected a short war. The Hellcat had been designed for a long war of attrition. It was built to take punishment and keep flying. It was built to be maintained by overworked carrier deck crews under combat conditions. It was built to be flown by hastily trained pilots and still achieve victory. Most importantly, it was built to bring pilots home alive. The statistics told the story. Of the 12,275 Hellcats produced, 270 were lost in air-to-air combat. That was a loss rate of barely 2%. Meanwhile, Hellcats had destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft, a kill-to-loss ratio that seemed almost fictional. For every Hellcat shot down by enemy fighters, 19 enemy aircraft were destroyed. I heard Grumman's plant on Long Island is already retooling for civilian production, Vrashu said. Jets are the future now. The Hellcat's obsolete before the war even ended. McCampbell smiled grimly. That's the nature of war. The weapons that win it are outdated by the time peace arrives. But that doesn't diminish what this aircraft accomplished. November 1945. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, Long Island. Leroy Grumman stood in the same assembly hall where the first Hellcat prototype had been built 3 years earlier. The building was mostly empty now. A few Hellcats remained on the production line, but these were the last. The Navy had cancelled further orders. The war was over. The Hellcat's work was done. An engineer approached, carrying a folder. Mr. Grumman, the final production numbers are complete. 12,275 aircraft delivered. Total program cost, $1.47 billion. Enemy aircraft destroyed, 5,156 confirmed, plus approximately 1,500 probables and damaged. American pilot losses in air combat, 270. Grumman took the folder, studying the numbers. By any measure, the F6F Hellcat had been the most successful fighter program in history. Not just in terms of kill ratios, but in terms of strategic impact. The Hellcat had enabled the entire island-hopping campaign. It had protected the carrier task forces that had brought the war to Japan's doorstep. It had achieved their superiority so complete that by 1945, American carriers could operate off the Japanese coast with near impunity. What about the pilots? Grumman asked. How many came home because of the armor, the self-sealing tanks, the structural strength? The engineer consulted another page. Difficult to quantify exactly, sir. But based on damage reports and pilot testimony, we estimate that at least 2,000 pilots survived combat damage that would have been fatal in an earlier fighter. The armor stopped bullets. The tanks didn't explode. The A-frame held together long enough to get back to the carrier. 2,000 pilots. 2,000 men who went home to their families, who lived to see their children grow up, who didn't become names on a memorial wall. That, Grumman thought, was the real measure of success. He walked to the window overlooking the airfield, where a single Hellcat was performing a test flight, one of the final aircraft off the production line. The pilot put it through a series of aerobatic maneuvers, loops, rolls, Cuban 8s. The Hellcat performed flawlessly, its distinctive blue-gray paint scheme catching the late autumn sunlight. Grumman remembered the dark days of 1942, when the reports from the Pacific had made clear that American fighters were being slaughtered. He remembered the pressure, the impossible deadline, the knowledge that every day of delay meant more pilots dying. He remembered the gamble of building a heavier fighter, of prioritizing survivability over pure performance, of trusting that American pilots could win if given the right tools. The gamble had paid off beyond his wildest projections. December 1945. Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhirter walked across the ramp toward his Hellcat for what he knew would be his last flight in the aircraft. The war was over. He was being discharged. The Navy was drawing down, and peacetime had no need for thousands of combat pilots. He climbed into the cockpit one last time, running through the familiar checklist from memory. Fuel, check. Oil pressure, check. Magnetos, check. The R2800 engine rumbled to life with the same powerful growl it had made on his first flight 3 years earlier. McWhirter taxied to the runway and advanced the throttle. The Hellcat accelerated, lifted cleanly, and climbed into the Virginia sky. He turned east, toward the Atlantic, and pushed the aircraft to 15,000 feet. For 30 minutes, he flew aerobatics, pushing the Hellcat through every maneuver he'd learned: loops, barrel rolls, Immelman turns, split S dives. The aircraft responded perfectly, as it always had. He remembered his first combat mission, the terror of diving into a formation of Zeros, the shock of how quickly the Hellcat had dispatched them. He remembered the turkey shoot, where the sky had been so full of falling Japanese aircraft that it seemed like some kind of surreal dream. He remembered his own kills, 8 confirmed, and the knowledge that each one represented a Japanese pilot who wouldn't attack American ships, wouldn't kill American sailors, wouldn't prolong the war. He also remembered the Hellcat pilots who hadn't come home. The aircraft was tough, nearly indestructible, but it wasn't invincible. Men had died. Good men, skilled pilots, friends. The Hellcat had saved thousands, but it couldn't save everyone. As McWhirter turned back toward Oceana for his final landing, he thought about the Japanese pilots who had mocked the Hellcat when it first appeared. Those pilots had been confident, experienced, victorious. They'd flown the Zero, an aircraft so dominant in 1942 that it seemed unbeatable. But aviation warfare wasn't about individual aircraft performance. It was about systems. It was about training. It was about logistics. It was about industrial capacity. It was about tactical doctrine. And on every one of those metrics, America had simply been better. The Hellcat wasn't better than the Zero because it could turn tighter or climb faster. It was better because it was designed for the war that actually existed, not the war Japan had hoped to fight. It was better because it protected its pilots. It was better because it could be mass-produced. It was better because it could be maintained under combat conditions. It was better because it fit perfectly into the American system of carrier warfare. McWhirter touched down on Oceana's runway for the last time, feeling the familiar jolt as the Hellcat's landing gear absorbed the impact. He taxied to the parking area, shut down the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The war was over. The killing was done. But the memory of what this aircraft had accomplished would endure. He climbed out, saluted the crew chief who'd maintained his aircraft through dozens of missions, and walked away without looking back. Behind him, rows of Hellcats sat on the tarmac, aircraft that would soon be scrapped, sold as surplus, or stored in the desert. The jet age was dawning. The Hellcat belonged to history now. March 1946. Imperial Japanese Navy Aviation Museum, Tokyo, under American occupation. Commander Minoru Genda stood before the wreckage of an A6M Zero, salvaged from a battlefield in the Philippines. The fighter had been cut nearly in half by .50 caliber fire, the distinctive work of a Hellcat. Genda had survived the war, one of the few senior Japanese aviators to do so, and now served as a consultant to the American occupation forces, helping them understand Japanese aviation doctrine. An American naval intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander James Pearson, approached. Commander Genda, I've read your reports on the F6F. You predicted early on that it would dominate the air war. What made you realize this? Genda gestured to the destroyed Zero. This aircraft was designed for a specific tactical situation, air superiority in the opening phase of a war against less prepared opponents. It was perfect for that mission. But the Americans learned from their defeats. They analyzed our advantages and built an aircraft specifically to counter them. He walked to a board displaying photographs of various aircraft. He pointed to a Hellcat. The F6F wasn't designed to be the most maneuverable or the fastest. It was designed to win. Those are different things. Your engineers understood something we did not. In a long war, survivability matters more than peak performance. A pilot who survives can learn, can improve, can fight again. A dead pilot, no matter how skilled, is simply dead. Pearson nodded, making notes. Our kill ratios seem almost impossible. 19-1 overall. Some squadrons achieve ratios above 20-1. How do you explain this? Genda's expression darkened. By 1944, we were sending boys into combat with barely 100 hours of flight time. Your pilots had 300, 400, sometimes 500 hours before they saw combat. They trained in the Hellcat specifically. They learned tactics designed for the Hellcat's strengths. They flew in teams, using radio communication and mutual support. Our pilots flew alone, relying on individual skill that our new pilots simply didn't possess. He paused, remembering. I flew against your Hellcats myself in late 1944. I was one of Japan's most experienced pilots, over 3,000 hours flight time. Even I could not defeat a well-flown Hellcat in combat. The aircraft gave away nothing. If I tried to climb, it outclimbed me above 15,000 feet. If I tried to dive away, it followed effortlessly. If I got a position advantage, its armor absorbed my fire while its 6 heavy machine guns destroyed my aircraft with a single burst. What about Japanese technological responses? Pearson asked. The Raiden, the Shiden, the Shidenkai, these were all attempts to match the Hellcat's performance. Gender nodded. Yes. And they came close in terms of raw specifications. But we could not match your production numbers, your pilot training system, your logistical support. By the time we fielded improved fighters, you already had thousands of Hellcats in service and thousands of experienced pilots. We were always responding to your innovations, never anticipating them. He turned to face Pearson directly. The F6F Hellcat won the air war in the Pacific not because it was a miracle weapon, but because it was the right weapon for the war being fought. It was good enough in all the ways that mattered, and it was available in overwhelming numbers. That is the lesson. Perfect weapons that arrive late are useless. Good weapons that arrive in quantity win wars. June 1946. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman stood before a conference room filled with Navy brass and civilian defense analysts, delivering the final report on carrier aviation in the Pacific War. Behind him, a large photograph showed a Hellcat in flight, sun glinting off its canopy. Gentlemen, the statistics are clear, Sherman said, pointing to a chart. The F6F Hellcat accounted for 5,156 confirmed aerial victories, approximately 75% of all Navy air-to-air kills during the war. No other fighter, in any service, in any nation, achieved comparable results. He clicked to the next slide, showing production numbers. 12,275 aircraft produced over 3 years. Peak production reached 500 aircraft per month. By comparison, Japan produced approximately 10,000 Zero fighters over the entire war, and the Zero was their primary naval fighter. Another slide, pilot losses. 270 Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat versus 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed. This 19-to-1 kill ratio enabled Task Force 38 and Task Force 58 to operate with near impunity in Japanese-controlled waters. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. By 1945, Japanese pilots were terrified of encountering Hellcats. A Marine general in the audience raised his hand. Admiral, the Army Air Force claims that P-51 Mustang was the war's best fighter. How do you respond? Sherman smiled. The P-51 was an excellent aircraft, arguably the best long-range escort fighter of the war. But it operated in a different environment. The Hellcat was designed for carrier operations, which imposes unique constraints. It needed to be rugged enough to survive catapult launches and arrested landings hundreds of times. It needed to be maintainable by carrier deck crews working in combat conditions. It needed to operate in salt spray without corroding. The Hellcat excelled in all these areas. He advanced to another slide showing a damaged Hellcat that had made it back to its carrier despite massive battle damage. The entire tail section was shredded, holes punctured the wings, and the engine cowling was partially torn away. This aircraft, flown by Ensign Robert Burnell, took fire from 3 Zeros simultaneously. The pilot was wounded. The hydraulics were destroyed. Half the rudder was shot away. But the armor protected the pilot enough that he remained conscious. The engine kept running. The aircraft held together. Burnell landed successfully and flew again 2 weeks later. That's the genius of the Hellcat, not that it prevented damage, but that it absorbed damage and kept fighting. Sherman clicked to his final slide, a simple bar chart comparing Allied fighter effectiveness. The Hellcat's bar towered over all others. The F6F Hellcat was not the fastest fighter. It was not the most maneuverable. It was not the most heavily armed. But it was the most effective, and in war, effectiveness is all that matters. This aircraft fulfilled its design mission completely. It wrested air superiority from the Japanese and maintained it until Japan's surrender. By that measure, it may have been the most successful fighter aircraft ever built. September 1946. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation Memorial Service, Bethpage. Nearly 3,000 people gathered at Grumman's facility for a ceremony honoring the Hellcat program. Workers who'd built the aircraft. Engineers who'd designed it. Pilots who'd flown it in combat. Families of those who hadn't returned. Leroy Grumman stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd. Behind him, a single Hellcat sat on display, the 12,275th and final aircraft produced, polished to perfection. We built this aircraft, Grumman began, his voice carrying across the silent assembly, because American pilots were dying. They were brave, they were skilled, but they were dying because the aircraft they flew couldn't match the enemy's. That was unacceptable. So we set out to build something better. He gestured to the Hellcat behind him. We didn't try to build the perfect fighter. We tried to build the fighter that would win, and there's a difference. The Hellcat is heavy. It's not as agile as the Zero, but it brings pilots home. It destroys enemy aircraft. It wins battles. Those three things mattered more than any performance metric. Grumman paused, his voice growing emotional. Over 12,000 Hellcats were built in this facility and in our Philadelphia plant. Every one of those aircraft represented hundreds of workers, men and women who worked double shifts, who sacrificed, who understood that every aircraft they built might save American lives. You did that. You built those aircraft. And because of your work, thousands of pilots came home who otherwise would have died. The crowd was silent, many wiping their eyes. The Japanese pilots who mocked the Hellcat, Grumman continued, who called it slow and clumsy, who believed their Zeros were superior, those pilots learned a hard truth. Aerial combat isn't about dogfighting artistry. It's about who lives and who dies. The Hellcat killed 5,156 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 to air combat. That's not because our pilots were necessarily better, though many were excellent. It's because we gave them the right tool for the job. He turned to look at the Hellcat behind him. This aircraft won the air war in the Pacific. Not alone, we had brave pilots, skilled crews, brilliant tacticians. But the Hellcat was the foundation. It was the weapon that turned the tide. And now its service is complete.